What if the most glamorous era in Hollywood history was also its darkest secret? The Golden Age, those shimmering decades of perfectly pressed suits, red lipstick, and silver screen magic, was built on something far more sinister than anyone dared to whisper. Beneath the studio lights, a shadow network controlled everything: careers, contracts, and sometimes lives. Some stars played along, some resisted. And a select few? They did the unthinkable. They vanished, not into tragedy, but into survival. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the celebrities who allegedly staged their own exits to escape the most powerful criminal organization Hollywood has ever refused to acknowledge. Permise. Jean Harlow, the blonde bombshell who may have lived past 1937. Jean Harlow was perhaps the most electrifying screen presence of the early 1930s. She burned through every frame she appeared in, a raw, almost reckless energy that no studio could fully manufacture or contain. MGM tried anyway. Louis B. Mayer's machinery packaged her, scheduled her, and most importantly, owned her in every contractual sense of the word. But here is where the story gets complicated. Harlow's official death in June 1937, attributed to kidney failure at just 26 years old, left investigators, historians, and Hollywood insiders deeply unsatisfied for decades. The medical timeline has been questioned repeatedly. Her mother, a Christian Scientist, famously refused early medical treatment, which the official narrative leans on heavily. But several researchers in later decades pointed to something far more troubling. Harlow had reportedly begun communicating with federal investigators about financial arrangements between MGM's upper management and organized crime figures tied to Chicago's outfit. The allegation, never proven, never fully buried, is that Harlow's exit was facilitated, not by illness alone, but by a network that decided a talking Harlow was more dangerous than a dead one. Certain conspiracy historians have pointed to a woman matching Harlow's description, living under a different identity in rural Arizona through the late 1940s, allegedly confirmed by a former studio driver who claimed he was paid to transport her out of California the night before her official death was announced. No body was ever subjected to modern forensic examination. Her sealed records remained heavily restricted for decades. Was it grief, or was someone making sure the question stopped? 2. Thelma Todd, the ice cream blonde whose death never added up. Thelma Todd was funny, fearless, and apparently inconvenient. The comedian and actress who lit up screens alongside the Marx Brothers and Laurel and Hardy was found deceased in her garage in December 1935. Carbon monoxide, said the official report. Case closed, said the Los Angeles authorities with suspicious efficiency. Except nothing about it was ever closed. The grand jury investigation that followed became one of Hollywood's most notoriously buried proceedings. Witnesses contradicted each other. The timeline of the night in question had more holes than a studio backlot fence. And most significantly, Lucky Luciano, one of the most powerful organized crime figures in American history, had allegedly been pressuring Todd to allow illegal gambling operations to run out of her roadside restaurant on the Pacific Coast Highway. Todd refused, repeatedly and publicly, according to people close to her at the time. The controversial theory which has circulated in Hollywood research circles for generations, suggests Todd did not actually perish that night. Instead, a coordinated effort involving studio fixers, corrupt law enforcement contacts, and syndicate connections allowed her to disappear with a new identity rather than face the alternative consequence of her continued refusal. The woman allegedly became a school teacher in Northern California, with multiple individuals in the 1960s claiming to recognize her from photographs shown by a journalist investigating the original case. The Los Angeles DA's files on the Todd case were reportedly purged during a records reorganization in the 1950s. Convenient timing. Remarkably convenient. 3. Bugsy Siegel's Hollywood Circle. The stars who knew too much. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was not a celebrity himself, but his web stretched across Hollywood with a reach that would make any studio executive envious. He dined with stars, attended premieres, and maintained close personal friendships with major figures, including George Raft, who essentially served as his ambassador between two worlds. The controversial dimension here involves multiple lesser-known actors and industry figures from the mid-1940s who were reportedly connected to Siegel's information network. When Siegel was shot in June 1947, a quiet but significant wave of disappearances followed. Not violent disappearances, strategic ones. At least 3 supporting actors who had worked with Siegel-connected productions and who had allegedly served as couriers of information between the syndicate and studio executives vanished from Hollywood within 18 months of Siegel's death. Their official records show various causes. One supposedly relocated to Europe, one reportedly entered a sanitarium, one simply stopped appearing in any documented record after 1948. The theory circulating among old Hollywood researchers is that these individuals were given new identities by a faction within the syndicate that had no interest in further federal attention following Siegel's very public removal. Faking deaths or simply disappearing with syndicate assistance was, according to multiple organized crime historians, a fairly established practice for individuals who became liabilities but were considered too valuable or too loyal to be genuinely removed. The stars who knew too much didn't always end tragically. Sometimes they just ended officially. 4. Louis Wolheim, the character actor whose exit raised eyebrows. Louis Wolheim is not a household name today, but in the late 1920s and early 1930s, he was one of Hollywood's most distinctive presences, a hulking, broken-nosed character actor whose intensity anchored films like All Quiet on the Western Front. His official death in February 1931 from stomach cancer was accepted without much scrutiny at the time. But Wolheim had a background that the studio system worked very hard to obscure. He was a man of considerable intelligence, a Cornell-educated mathematician, with connections that reportedly extended beyond the film world into financial networks linked to East Coast organized crime money that was being laundered through early sound-era film financing. The controversial allegation, sourced from memoirs circulated privately among Hollywood historians in the 1970s, is that Wolheim became aware of the full scope of the financial network he was peripherally connected to and made the mistake of expressing discomfort with that knowledge to the wrong people. Rather than facing genuine elimination, individuals with his level of connection were sometimes offered a third option: a medically certified exit, a new identity, and a quiet life elsewhere. A man matching Wolheim's distinctive physical description, nearly impossible to replicate or mistake, was reportedly encountered by a studio accountant in Mexico City in 1938, 7 years after his supposed death. The accountant, interviewed years later, described the encounter in remarkable detail, including a brief conversation in which the individual allegedly said, "Some doors are better left closed, friend." 5. Olive Thomas, The Ziegfeld Girl, and the Question of 1920 Borderline Golden Age. While technically preceding the core 1930s window, Olive Thomas's story laid the foundation for every suspicious Hollywood exit that followed. The Ziegfeld Follies star and early film actress died in Paris in September 1920 under circumstances that were, at minimum, poorly investigated and, at maximum, deliberately obscured by parties with significant motivation. The official story involves accidental ingestion of her husband, Jack Pickford's mercury bichloride solution, used to treat a condition he had acquired during his time in the military. Thomas's death was ruled accidental, but the Parisian social world she had been moving through, one with considerable connections to European criminal networks dealing in substances and influence, raised significant questions about what she knew and who she had been speaking to. The theory persistent among early Hollywood researchers is that Thomas, who had been known to collect potentially damaging information about powerful industry figures, was helped to disappear into the European underground with a new identity, with the Paris incident serving as the official closing of her chapter. Multiple individuals in Paris through the 1930s reportedly claimed to have encountered a woman who matched Thomas perfectly, very much living a quiet civilian life under a French surname. Whether true or not, Thomas's story established a template: Paris, confusion, a rushed official conclusion, and questions that never quite went away. 6. Wallace Reid, the silent era's All-American and the machine behind him. Wallace Reid was the definition of the Golden Age ideal before the Golden Age officially began. Handsome, charming, athletic, and apparently perfect. What the studios carefully suppressed was the reality of how Reid had developed a dependency on substances administered to him by studio medical staff to keep him working through injuries, and, more importantly, what he had witnessed about the financial and criminal arrangements keeping the early studio system running. Reid's official death in January 1923 in a sanitarium occurred with remarkable speed after his condition became public knowledge. The conspiracy theory, which has remained remarkably consistent across decades of Hollywood underground research, centers on the claim that Reid's sanitarium death was facilitated by studio fixers who had reason to keep him permanently silent, but also reason to avoid the attention that a more direct resolution would bring. A man using a variation of Reid's middle name was reportedly documented living in Canada through the late 1920s and 1930s, working in agricultural business entirely disconnected from entertainment. Physical descriptions recorded by a Canadian journalist who encountered this individual in 1931 were described by those who knew Reid as unmistakable. The syndicate connections here are more indirect, organized crime money flowing through distribution networks, but the pattern is identical: a star who knew too much, a convenient medical exit, and a story that the studios made sure nobody wanted to investigate too closely. 7. Harry Houdini, the escape artist who may have escaped everything. Harry Houdini's case is perhaps the most philosophically perfect entry on this list, because if anyone in history had both the skills and the network to fake his own death convincingly, it was a man who spent his entire career making the impossible appear routine. Houdini's official death in October 1926, peritonitis, following a ruptured appendix, triggered by a blow to the stomach from a college student who wanted to test his strength, has been accepted in mainstream history. But Houdini researchers and investigators have circulated serious alternative theories for nearly a century. Houdini had, by the mid-1920s, become a significant thorn in the side of organized spiritualism networks that were, in some documented cases, financially linked to criminal money and exploitation operations targeting grieving families. His very public campaign against fraudulent mediums had made him enemies with genuine financial power and underworld connections. There are documented threats against him in the years preceding his death. The theory is that Houdini, a man who literally engineered ways to escape from every conceivable trap, orchestrated his most spectacular illusion with the cooperation of trusted inner circle members. He had the skills, he had the motivation, he had the contacts. His wife Bess's subsequent behavior, including her famous annual seance attempts to contact him, has been reinterpreted by some researchers as an elaborate public performance, maintaining the fiction of his death while privately remaining in some form of contact. An escape artist who finally used his greatest skill to escape for real. The story almost writes itself. 8. Peg Entwistle, the Hollywood sign actress, and the unanswered questions. Peg Entwistle's story is perhaps the most heartbreaking on this list in its official version. A British actress who climbed the Hollywood sign in September 1932 and did not return. Her death was ruled a tragic reflection of a career that hadn't reached the heights she'd hoped for. But almost immediately, serious inconsistencies began circulating among those who knew her. Entwistle had recently received a letter from a theater company offering her a significant role. A letter she reportedly received the very day she supposedly ended her life. A fact that struck those close to her as deeply inconsistent with suicide as a motivation. Her uncle, who filed the missing person report, described her emotional state in the preceding days as hopeful, genuinely hopeful, not despairing. The alternative theory, which has circulated in Los Angeles underground history circles for decades, centers on Entwistle's peripheral connection to production financing networks that had organized crime involvement. She had allegedly been present at gatherings where conversations occurred that she should not have overheard, and had reportedly confided to a friend that she was frightened of certain people in this town. The theory holds that Entwistle was helped to disappear using the Hollywood sign as a narrative device, a dramatic, story-complete endpoint that discouraged further investigation, while she relocated under a new identity. A woman matching her description, with her distinctive British accent, was reportedly working in a Connecticut theater company through the late 1930s under a different name. 9. Ted Healey, The Three Stooges, creator and the night it ended. Ted Healey is not remembered as well as the performers he launched, the Three Stooges, whom he originally managed and performed with. But within Hollywood's insider circles, his death in December 1937 remained one of the most discussed and disputed exits of the entire Golden Age. Healey died officially of acute toxic nephritis, kidney failure attributed to heavy drinking. He was 41. But the timeline of his final night was always contested. He had been involved in a brawl outside a restaurant, reportedly with individuals connected to organized crime figures with a grudge related to a financial dispute. The nature of that dispute, connected to entertainment industry money flows with syndicate involvement, was deliberately obscured in press reporting at the time. The alternative narrative persistent among Hollywood historians is that Healey's death was a facilitated exit, that the individuals involved in the brawl were persuaded or paid to allow him to disappear rather than face the consequences of a genuine elimination, which would have brought law enforcement attention neither party wanted. A comedian matching Healey's very distinctive performance style appeared at venues in the Midwest through the early 1940s under a stage name, according to entertainment trade publications of the era. Several former colleagues who saw these reports reportedly expressed private certainty about who this performer actually was. When pressed publicly, they retracted their statements with notable speed. 10. Paul Bern, Jean Harlow's husband and Hollywood's most suspicious exit. Paul Bern, MGM executive Jean Harlow's husband, was found dead of a gunshot wound in September 1932, just 2 months after their wedding. The official verdict was suicide. The note left at the scene was vague and deeply ambiguous. Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg were reportedly at the scene before the police arrived, a remarkable detail that was acknowledged but never properly scrutinized. The complications begin immediately. Bern had a common-law wife, Dorothy Millette, who drowned in the Sacramento River days after his death in what was ruled a second suicide, a statistical coincidence that strains credibility to a remarkable degree. Bern was, according to people who knew him, involved deeply in the financial architecture of MGM's dealings with distribution networks that had organized crime connections. The controversial theory, which has substantial documentation in Hollywood research literature, is that Bern did not actually die that night, that the scene was constructed by studio fixers with enough law enforcement contacts to control the investigation's conclusions, and that Bern was removed from California with a new identity to protect MGM from the exposure his continued existence and potential testimony represented. The parallel disappearance of Dorothy Millette, or the alleged parallel facilitated exit, is the detail researchers find most compelling. Two people connected to the same dangerous knowledge, both officially gone within days of each other, both in ways that closed questions rather than opened them. The Syndicate, as always, preferred closed chapters. The golden age of Hollywood was a machine, beautiful on the outside, grinding on the inside. The Syndicate didn't just influence movies. It influenced who lived publicly, who lived quietly, and who we were told had stopped living at all. Whether these stories are fragments of buried truth or the elaborate mythology that every great era inevitably generates, they force us to ask a question that Hollywood has always hated. Who was really in control? The stars we mourned may have been the lucky ones, the ones given a door out instead of no door at all. Subscribe, stay curious, and remember, in Hollywood, the most important performances were never captured on film.